Hey, today I'm talking to Ray Kon, the CMO of ARIMA, and we're talking about synthetic data. Don't know what that means? Me neither. Let's get started. Hey Ray, how's it going?
I'm good, Pete. It's great to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's nice to catch up again. I keep saying this over and over, but it's been an excuse for me to kind of make friends. Sabah introduced us, and he was on season 1 at some point. We were at Adventures, and I was speaking with him, and
Yeah.
we had this like little closet where we were doing the podcast. I was so embarrassed because the lighting and the sound was terrible. So I have to get him back at some point.
Well, he's been making the rounds. He travels in very different classes than I do. And so he just got back from Cannes where he was rubbing shoulders with all the, all the hoi polloi in the marketing world. And I can only dream of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know. But he works with you, right? At ARIMA.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
He came and joined us earlier this year on a
Oh,
fractional
okay.
basis, but we love his enthusiasm and his imagination and his ability to connect dots. It's wonderful.
Well, enough about him. How about you? So how long have you been at ARIMA now?
I joined ARIMA 3 years ago
Okay.
after a life in the corporate marketing world. And so the corporate marketing world, both in research and data and CRM at banks and insurance companies, I spent a good deal of time at Ipsos. And your probably follow-on question is, well, how did you come to be at ARIMA?
Mm-hmm.
So about 3 years ago, I was having lunch with a really good friend of mine, a longtime friend of mine. It was one of our first lunches after COVID. So I'm guessing it's actually longer than 3 years ago now. Maybe it was four. And it was
Right.
a beautiful sunny day. And we were sitting outside on a patio because that's what we did right after COVID. And we didn't eat indoors yet. We were sitting outside on a bright sunny day. And my friend, Chris, he says, I met this really interesting guy yesterday who I think you'll be very interested in. And he said, I met this guy, Winston. He has modeled a synthetic version of the Canadian population for marketing purposes. And I literally stopped with my fork halfway to my mouth. And I said, come again? And he said, Winston has modeled and created a synthetic population of Canada for marketing purposes. And I said, wait, that means you could. And Chris said, yup. And I said, and you could also. And Chris said, yup. And I said,
Yeah.
that changes everything. And Chris goes, yup. And fast forward to 6 months after that, I learned a little bit more about what ARIMA does, a little bit more about Winston and his background. I met Winston, we talked and we chatted, and 6 months later, it was like, Winston, I need to join you to build the future and to build this thing out because I am closer to retirement than many maybe of your listeners are. And
Mm.
I thought to myself, with the remaining useful years of my life, I want to build something for the future and be part of that, something future oriented. And so I dropped it all, left my cushy corporate life and joined the startup world.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. The chaos that is startup. I, I had a similar, I can't remember when I was introduced to this concept, but that notion of synthetic data and just, I couldn't believe it. And it seemed to happen early in at least in the public eyes. But do you mind just a quick, brief explanation of what that is? Because I think the concept's really interesting.
Sure, thanks for that. Yeah, let me back up half a step from that. And anybody who works with data knows that there are increasing and problems with data. And so the marketing world talks a lot about data-driven decision making, and yet the quality of the data on which we are basing our so-called data-driven decisions is deteriorating. It's deteriorating for a number of reasons. One is in the pure research world, so the primary research world, with survey research or polling world, there is a lot of respondent fatigue. And so there are
Right.
increasing demographics and segments of the population who are not responding to surveys and are very, very difficult to get, or there is a preponderance of response bots in the marketplace where you send out a survey and you can actually subscribe to a bot to answer that survey. And that's just random responses, or what in the research community is called straight lining. And so there's a quality deterioration in primary survey research on which many decisions are made. And then even first party data, data that is owned by loyalty programs or by the banks or by, Tim Hortons or whomever, there are limitations to that as well, because that data is limited to people who own the app or people who choose to participate in the loyalty program. So therefore, by
Right.
definition, you're customers only. And so there's a narrowness there.
I remember like we used to do a lot of UX research back in the day, and we got introduced to the concept of professional responders, like people who kind of did a lot of surveys and a lot of that to the point where they become invalid because they are so good at answering questions where you're trying to kind of get unexpected answers. You're getting people who are almost like pros at answering. Is that part of this as well?
That's part of it as well. And those professional responders sometimes will also be really good at sussing out what it is that they might
Yeah.
want you to hear. And
Yeah.
that's always been the case. And really good research firms have ways to mitigate these, but they are getting more and more so. And as the weight of decisions increases, and as the scrutiny on ROI and as the scrutiny on data-driven decision making increases, the quality of the data that we have to make our decisions and the connectedness of the data that we have to make our decisions is falling a little bit short. And so this is where synthetic data comes in. In its purest form, synthetic data is basically modeled data where real world data doesn't exist. And so a simple example might be, Pete, I'll say you're a 40-year-old male who lives in Calgary, who is married, and let's say you have two kids. I don't know how many kids you have, but let's say you have two kids. And we don't know what kind of car you drive, but we can model based on information that we know that you might own a sedan or a minivan or a SUV or something like that. And in the purest sense, what synthetic data is saying, you know what, Pete's household is likely to have an SUV. We don't know for a fact that you do. And actually, the other reason why primary data is starting to deteriorate is people's concerns over privacy, because
Right.
Pete
Right.
Bishop
Right.
may not want us to know that you have an SUV and maybe a Ferrari somewhere in a garage, for privacy reasons. And while we may not know that you have a Ferrari, we can imagine that you're more likely to have an SUV than Paul Bishop, who is of a similar age, lives in a similar area, but is a construction worker. And so we would imagine that Paul Bishop has a pickup truck and Pete Bishop has an SUV. We don't know that for sure, but that's what synthetic data is. It is a probabilistic model of not only car ownership, but behavior, store ownership based on real world data.
I'm really happy that you picked me out as 40. That's flattering. And you're pretty accurate with the SUV. I could see that really working well. The amount of data you must have to feed into this must be pretty significant for that to feel like a real audience. Is that fair?
Yes, it is fair. It is one of the reasons why synthetic data is, I will say, there's a lot of noise around it now, because just now the computing power and the computing algorithms to make it possible are just coming on stream and online now. Theoretically, it's been possible for many years. And it used to be called what was called data stitching, where you would take 2 surveys or 10 surveys, or in the case of ARIMA, 26 different survey data pieces, and you'd stitch the data together in a probabilistic way, like a really large Sudoku. So, more or less, for anybody who does Sudoku, you know that the rows and the columns need to add to 10. In each row and in each column, you can only have 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, whatever. And so, we know that in a postal code, there's a Pete Bishop and there's a Paul Bishop, both are the same age. One's a construction worker, one's an advertising executive innovator. And we know that from StatsCan that there is one SUV and one pickup truck in that postal code. And so we're going to guess that Paul Bishop owns the pickup truck and Pete Bishop owns the SUV. Now, that's a very simple example, but you multiply that by 26 data sources, 60,000 variables. No human can do that. You need to probabilistically do that using an AI algorithm.
It's fascinating. So, we talked a lot about kind of the disadvantages of, the old way of how we're doing it and then maybe some of the fatigue that's happening. For this, there must be a lot of advantages beyond just pricing and speed, right? There must be, like, for me, the fatigue side, you could ask this group ad nauseum, I expect, as many questions as you want, as often as you want, right?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And, one of the interesting things, we just did a test with a research partner. One of the interesting findings out of this test is that in the real world, you might say, uh, do you think that Canada's inflation rate is going to go up or down, or I don't know? And a lot of people will answer, I don't know.
Right.
In the
Right.
synthetic research world, you're not allowed to answer, I don't know. The model will always assign a yes or a no. And so you actually get you get more completed answers. So the advantages other than cost and speed, which you have outlined already, is I'll call it data completeness. So in our hypothetical example, we have, in ARIMA's case, we have 60,000 behavioral, psychographic, demographic variables on Pete Bishop, or the synthetic Pete Bishop, and the synthetic Paul Bishop. You might recall that one of the disadvantages to traditional data is that I might have Pete Bishop's attitudes towards the Alberta government, and then over here I might have Paul Bishop's attitudes towards pet ownership, but I don't have Pete Bishop's attitudes towards pet ownership or Paul
Right.
Bishop's attitudes towards the Alberta government. But in a synthetic data situation, you actually have all variables for all synthetic individuals, which allows for really interesting cross category explorations for innovation use cases, for new product concept in use cases. And so, we had a use case where a candle manufacturer came to us and said, we really need to look for males of this gender who use candles. Well, there's no survey that talks about candle usage amongst young males, for example, but our data has that. Or another interesting example, a real life example, is that one of our clients is a outdoor clothing manufacturer who wants to come out with a line of pet clothing. So your
Right.
pampered pet can walk down the street in the middle of winter with a down jacket made by this clothing manufacturer, but they had no data whatsoever on their customer base or even their prospect database on pet ownership, what kinds of pets were owned, where they shopped for pet supplies, how much they spent on pet supplies. And we had all of that. We have all of that information because we have 360 degrees worth of data on every synthetic individual in our population.
So just to dig into that, how is that? Like, so you mentioned the candle, right? Like, at some point, is it just because you can query this with anything you want, or it's been queried so much that it actually has that data already in it? Like, how would it know about candles out of that data? I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
It's a little bit of both. So we buy a lot of usage and attitude data to
Okay.
seed the synthetic population. So whether it comes from
Mm,
Numeris, or whether it comes from Vividata, or whether it comes from a media company, whether it comes from the Canadian government, the University of Calgary, wherever. And so there's two parts to what we do. We buy a lot of source data,
right.
and that source data covers a lot of ground. And using our proprietary algorithm, we take, let's say it's a survey of 50,000 individuals, we then probabilistically create our database of 30 million for Canada for those variables. But we don't cover it all. So
Right.
we've actually also developed an algorithm which allows us to query and ask the synthetic population about variables that we don't have. So, for example, at the height, when the US was starting to impose tariffs, I guess it was just about a year ago, or maybe a little bit more than a year ago, many of our clients said, we need to understand what our audience's reaction to those tariffs might be based on these parameters. And so using our algorithm, we are able to get a sense of that from the population within a very short amount of time. Now it's modeled for sure. It's not actually going out and asking people the question, but it's saying if somebody, if somebody votes conservative, believes in A, B, or C, has the family value of, family's the only thing, then they're more likely to answer yes to tariffs than no to tariffs. I'm making that string up, but you can see that there's a string of logic. It's actually called a multi-step reasoning approach that says
Right.
if this, then this, if this, then that, if this, then that, if this, then yes to the question. Much more complicated than that, but that's kind of the idea. And so you can fill in the data gaps as well. And it self perpetuates because the more you have, the more data points you can triangulate to fill in the missing data, so to speak.
Oh, that's brilliant. So, well, we talked a little bit about, like, obviously the upside. Is there a downside to this, or does this replace like traditional research, or is there a balance, or how do you see this unfolding as it kind of moves ahead?
I think there's a couple time horizons to your question. And I think your question's a really, really good one. And it's a little bit untestable.
Right.
We recently
Right.
did a test with a research partner where what they did was actually do a live survey, and then they
Hmm.
compared their live survey results against the same questions asked of our synthetic population. By and large, and there were four criteria. It was a very statistically well-grounded test. The upshot of it is like, wow, the company that did the test, they were like, wow, we were really impressed with how good the answers were. Now, there were limitations. If you asked very future oriented questions, like, do you think you're going to get married in the next 3 years? Those answers versus the real live answers were not really comparable because the data we have by its nature is hindsight looking, less foresight looking.
Right. Yeah.
There were language issues, there were various issues, and but we are at what I would call, version 2 of synthetic data right now. And, let's say in 5 years, we might be at version 5. And in 7 years, we might be at version 17. And so
Mm.
in that, what did I say, 7 year span, the use cases are going to get so much better. It's going to get so much, more accurate. Today, there are outages, there are known outages, and there's clunkiness, um, but as you already identified, it is a self-perpetuating model. It's a machine learning model. The more it learns, the better it gets. The more data it has, the better it will learn going forward.
Yeah.
Will it
Right. And
replace primary research? I don't believe so, because
yeah.
primary research is always the seed. The spine of the ARIMA synthetic population is the census data, which is every 4 years. We can't build it without census data. We can't build it
Right.
without some actual starter. I don't do sourdough, but you need a sourdough starter to get it going. Otherwise, you're just making it up as you go along. So there will always be a place for primary research. There will always be a place for certain types of primary research. This is an augmentation and is a complement rather than a replacement. I think there is one thing that I want to say is that I think we're still at the stage of buyer beware. And so there are synthetic data sources with with
Mm.
what I will call dubious provenance. And so there are some synthetic data sources where they will say, well, you just tell us who your target audience is. Females 35 to 50 who have body conscious images, negative body conscious image. And they will then, they will have an interface that allows you to ask questions of those, but you don't know where that data is being drawn from to give you those
Right.
answers. And so there is very much a buyer beware mentality that I think users of synthetic data have to have today still, because, you know, everybody knows the term AI hallucination. And so there is
Right.
synthetic data hallucination. If you don't know the source data, if you don't know how the persona or the population is made, you don't know where your answers are coming from, it is not a good thing to be just blindly trusting them when you have multi-million dollar decisions to make based on the outcome.
I feel like that's good advice for life right now. Just understanding your data. Like, there's a lot of people, especially when you're dealing with even Anthropic or OpenAI, just understanding where were things trained? Where's this stuff coming through, right? I had a friend that was, I don't know, hopefully I'm not repeating myself, but I had a friend who was, every time he was getting a response out of chat, it was saying something like, thanks for tuning in on the end of all this stuff. And he's like, what is this coming from? And he's like, yeah, it's because it was trained on YouTube data. So most of the time it's talking about episodes. And that was kind of how it would sign stuff off. So when you're like, that's where that's from, right? And you just don't realize, oh, that's right. Yeah, it is a product of its data. And if the data's garbage in, garbage out half the time, right? So it's really important to know where it's coming from, because I think these days that's just part of being literate in AI. And this is no different by the sounds of it.
It's no different. And if the person who's providing your synthetic data or the synthetic data source is a little bit vague and cagey about what the data source is, then I would say run away, right? You want people who are open and you need to understand, because there's, particularly for, agencies or brands or whoever, like I said, there's big money decisions at stake here,
Yeah.
and you need to know.
Yeah. And your reputation's on the line, right? Still is,
Hmm.
right? No matter what. How do you kind of keep bias out of this? Like, I think that's true of any research, right? And anyone you're talking to, but especially if you're using research that's already been done, is it the same problem that you would have anywhere else, or is it different because of this new model?
Bias, things like non-response bias or
Right.
unconscious biases, which all of us humans have, those are
Yeah.
present in any type of research. And there are ways to mitigate against that. They do get, they can get magnified when you are taking, let's say, a sample of 10,000 and you're making it 30 million, because some would argue that what
Right.
you're doing is you're actually magnifying the bias. And there is some validity to that. There's
Right.
two mitigations, though. One mitigation is that we use multiple data sources. And so while there are systemic biases in things like non-response bias, you actually do lessen that by using multiple data sources. Secondly, the models that we've created, actually we create some randomness into the algorithm to try to lessen that. Now, is there proof that it does or does not? Theoretically, yes, but is there empirical proof that it does? No. And so, in the simple example that we have now, we know that Pete Bishop is an advertising executive and so therefore probably owns an SUV, and Paul
Mm.
Bishop is a construction worker. So the model would definitely say that he would probably own the pickup truck. But when we introduce randomness in there, randomly it will say, but no, you know what? We're going to give Pete the pickup truck and Paul Bishop the SUV, just because we want to introduce that randomness into the model to reduce any kind of systemic bias or other systemic issues that might be present in the source data.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is this just for big business? Like, I'm just trying to get a sense of scale. Like, can any business kind of use synthetic data at this level, or is this kind of big problems only and big money only kind of thing?
I guess it depends on who you ask. And
Yeah.
there are many versions of synthetic data. Our approach has been we're a bunch of data geeks who've spent our time in this world for many years. And sometimes we say to each other, we're building the tools that we wish we always had. And so the
Right.
data and the tools that we've built on top of this to access that data, because it's really important to access the data, are available to anybody and are built for non-data scientists. And so we have a platform that sits on top of our data, which is really easy to use and yet really powerful. The the analogy that I will draw is that the platform that we have is similar to uh, our do-it-yourself tax platforms these days. You go
Oh
to
yeah.
Intuit or Wealthsimple or whatever to do your taxes. You input your data, there's a bot that pops up and says, if you increase your RSP contribution, you could save this much, or if you gave that much more to charity, you could do this, that, or the other. And there's a very dynamic, iterative interface. And we don't need to know tax law. to file our taxes anymore. We allow the AI and the platform to guide us. And so we have built a platform on top of our synthetic data that guides and helps the users through the process to answer whatever question they have, whatever questions or whatever marketing problems that they're trying to solve without an analytics background. And so they can model cross media plans without really needing to know advanced statistics. We can, we have a GIS module which allows for mapping and of traffic patterns without really needing to understand the principle of centroids and of, how the postal codes overlap or don't overlap. It just does it for you. It just helps you do it, let's put it that way. So it
Oh
is
my goodness.
accessible to everybody. We've tried to make it accessible to everybody. And in fact, most of our clients, and I don't want to shill too much, but most of our clients are small to medium size agencies and small to medium sized brands. Literally, I just spoke to a a brand new client just before coming on to this call, and she wants to activate 15 to 20 of her team, everything from a media buyer to a junior analyst to a to their head of stats, to everybody to use it, so that it makes the data and data driven decision making accessible to all. Whereas once, it was always a great theory, but in practice it was not so.
Yeah, it's funny because when you hear it all explained, it feels like such a no-brainer. But I also get why people are so reluctant, because it's a big mind shift to, and for the people who are thinking, the robots are taking over everything, and this is definitely one of those moments where you're like, oh my goodness, we're all getting replaced by robots here. But you can really see the advantage of doing this type of thing, and like you said, removing some of that fatigue. I remember doing surveys where like, wow, we can't ask more than 15 questions because people just get tired, so too bad. And it's like, well, you could ask 1,000 questions.
And attention spans, like, I don't know about you, but I can't even sit through a 10-minute YouTube video anymore. Give me
Right.
the 30-second version.
No, it just seems fascinating. So do you feel like that's the barrier in thinking, just getting your brain rewired for this moment? But what would be some of the like reasons why people wouldn't do this, I guess, or that you hear of, like, what are the common reasons they're like, oh, what about this? What about that?
Yeah, and there's a lot of what about this and what about that, and it's absolutely valid. The main one is like, how valid is this data? It is a mind shift for sure. The first EVs were introduced in 2002. And I remember hearing about the first electric vehicles, batteried vehicles, and it was like, oh, that's awesome. Well, but I have a car already that I just bought 3 years ago. And what about charging infrastructure? And what about reliability? And what about this? And what about that? And change takes time,
Mm-hmm.
period. Change takes times, and this is a big mind shift, as you have already identified. And so it will take time. The early adopters will adopt, and they'll create use cases that will that will convince the mass, and then the mass will then convince the late adopters, and so the cycle goes with anything new.
Mm-hmm.
My advice to everybody, though, is you got to jump in and just start to use it. Doesn't have to be in a big way. You don't have to base multi-gazillion dollar decisions on it, but you need to be familiar. There's so many different sources and types of synthetic data. You need to understand them. You need to understand the use cases that are right for you and your organization or you as an individual, because it is moving quickly. And you used the analogy before when we were talking, Pete. If you dropped an iPhone 17 on somebody to begin with, you would be lost because you wouldn't know how to use the functionality. But we started with iPhone 2s, and then they went to iPhone 3s, and then we went to iPhone 4s, and everyone got incrementally better until we're now at, I don't even know what we're at now, 17 or 18.
Yeah, I think so.
And the advanced, early adopters are using those, well, or Discord, or using Discord, in ways that us Luddites can't even imagine. They're at the leading edge. And but if you don't get started, then you are going to be behind the curve, because the early adopter companies are embracing it in a very big way and are gaining meaningful competitive advantage from it, from synthetic data.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I don't know if this will make the podcast, but I do need to talk to you, I think, a little bit about travel research because I'm in the middle of it and I would love your perspective on it. It's just kind of like the new travel behavior using AI tools and how they're
Yeah.
booking differently.
Well, and we actually have two cruise companies, three destination X, like destination Toronto, destination BC types of, I guess those are tourism boards as clients. One of the reasons why I think I might have, so ARIMA has a synthetic population of Canada, a synthetic population of the US, a synthetic population of Germany, and a synthetic population of the UK. And the reason we built a synthetic population of Germany and the UK to start with, because they may seem like odd choices, was that one of our clients said, we need to target tourists from those countries to come to Canada, and we
Right.
need the synthetic population to do that. One of the other things that we're doing is building a synthetic population of fans. So, sports fans, because
Oh,
sports fans
right.
are not just sports fans, they consume on media, they consume gaming, they travel, they consume in stadium, they buy merchandise. They are definitely multifaceted, and understanding that group is something that one of our very large clients has identified. And so they are funding our development of that database. But travel is definitely one of those pieces as well. When we think about travel, well, gosh, my eyes were completely opened wide when I saw the travel behavior around this World Cup. I had never appreciated before the extent to which people will travel to follow their team during the World Cup. And,
Oh, I believe it. Yeah.
and
Like
so that,
fanatics.
but maybe not even when I saw the pictures of the Tartan army in Scotland and the number of people in
Oh,
Scotland,
yeah.
or witnessed the number of people of the last game was the Portuguese in Toronto, and they closed
Right.
down the 427 because they were jamming up the 427 waiting for Ronaldo and the team bus to drive by. I mean, it's like, what the heck? This is crazy, man.
I was in Scotland when they won their first game, which they were not expecting to win any of them, and they gave everybody the day off the next day because they knew that no one was going to be able to work.
Well, or just to see the pictures at the Red Sox games of them taking over the stadium, and I mean, it
Oh,
was so
yeah.
much fun. It's not over yet, but it's
Yeah,
so
I
much. It's
imagined
over for Toronto anyway, but it's so much fun. It's
there
over
must
for
be so much
Canada too, I guess.
data pouring out of those things too, just like realizing how, like, I thought it was really neat to see how Canada got on board this year. It's not like they haven't in the past, but this year feels especially big. And it's just like, what's driving that and why are we so excited about it this year? Obviously hosting, but there's lots of
Yeah.
other things I'm sure at play. It's yeah, it must be a fascinating job just in general, watching trends and seeing what's ticking and what's not. There's all sorts of insights I imagine you get.
One of the things that we say to our detriment is that use cases are limited only by imagination.
Mm,
And it's to our detriment because people are, in this type of world, people are not good at imagining things. You know, we couldn't imagine where the internet was going, when we first heard about the internet, and this is kind of the same. But imagine, and we do, have mobility data on top of our synthetic people. And so now you can understand travel patterns, time of day where people, spend their evenings. We have a golf course client who used the data to model before and after the round. Where are people going before the round? Where are people going after the round?
mm.
So that we can understand. Actually, we have an auto dealer who does the same, models the before and after. What dealerships is our audience visiting before they come to our dealership, and what audiences, where do they visit afterwards, and where are they going? And that way we can better shape our marketing messages and our out of home placements and our offer tailor our offers better because we know they're visiting Toyota before they come to us. And so we can target Toyota. I mean, that kind of thing is possible when you have synthetic population data.
My
It
head's
blows your
spinning
mind.
right now, and it's not just because of my hangover. The I do think I love the thought around the only limit. I've said this a lot. Like the only limit right now is your imagination. It really feels like that with the tools that we have at our disposal lately. I feel like that. I feel like I am constantly not thinking big enough because you can do these things, and this is such a great example. And I think it's been around for a while. Like we did talk a little bit around, this notion of creating a persona and then asking it questions. I've seen people create like their board of directors, like a virtual group of them, and feed them all their personality, ticks and everything like that, and then present to them and try and like work out some of their problems ahead of time before presenting to their board. Like things like that feels like it's like that on steroids is what's been built here, right?
Yes. That actually brings up a good analogy, I think, Pete. You asked about, will primary research ever go away? And so let's call synthetic data a flight simulator. And,
Hmm.
with modern flight simulators, you can spend hours and hours and hours learning how to fly, and you can pretend to crash the plane, and you can cut out engines, you can do all kinds of scenarios in a very safe environment. But nobody's going to give you a pilot's license without having you be in a real plane, flying in real world, and having a certain number of hours in a real plane. So synthetic data is kind of the same. You can play all you want, but at the end of the day, I think most people will still want to test the new packaging in a test market, or, you know, try out a new, test communications A versus B, or, you know, test in the real world before you give the pilot's license, right? Air Canada's never going to give somebody a pilot's license who's never flown anything but a flight simulator. But the flight simulator is so valuable for training. It cuts the training cost, it cuts the training time, it increases the value of training, but all in a very safe environment. And so synthetic data and what we call population simulators are the same. They're just a place that you can test and accelerate your triage your bad ideas out,
Mm-hmm.
and all of those kinds of things.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, I love that. It does feel like a safe spot to ask maybe stupid questions, or probably ask more questions than you would have, right? Because it is so accessible and probably a little more efficient to try things out and experiment, and maybe get to find those areas and insights that you would never have otherwise found because of the time and effort it would take to do that, right?
Or because, it's synthetic populations and they're not allowed to say don't know, you could find things that you may not have ever occurred to you before, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah. No, exactly. Let's end on this question, because I am curious about this. Just if you can fast forward 5 years from now, where do you think ARIMA is going? Where is all of this going? Do you figure, like, what does it look like?
I think that it will be much more wide. Things like what you said, like recreating the board of directors, or ARIMA was asked to recreate the House of Representatives in the US. I think those are extreme cases. There are data integrity reasons why those small audiences will not get created. But the use of synthetic personas, and particularly the use of synthetic populations, will become, I think, a lot more commonplace than they are now. Earlier this year, in May, Gartner came out with a report that basically said that by 2030, 80% of 80% of companies globally will use synthetic data at scale for decision making, up from 10% today. It will accelerate very quickly. It will become more commonplace. It will never replace primary research, because you'll never give somebody a pilot's license without them actually flying a plane.
Mm-hmm.
But it will become more commonplace, and the quality of the use cases and the quality of the data will just only get better with time. Now, my advice to everybody, as I said before, is always just get started now, because 2030 is only 4 years from now. And that's not very long.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, there's no pilot these days that doesn't have to spend a certain amount of time in a simulator, right? So it's become commonplace. But all these things just take time, and once that little, the fear of this or the anxiety around it, kind of you get over that little hump, then it grows so quickly, right? And there's, like, you see this all throughout our careers for the most part. You saw when the internet came in. I remember, not to pick on Scotland again, but there at one point the government decided to put a computer with a modem into every household in Scotland, and a lot of them just looked at it like the devil's box, and it just sat in a corner and no one used it, right? But once you get over the hump of like, oh, okay, I get this now, and it's starting to feel normalized, then you just see it kind of connect and swing up, and it feels like this is in that moment, right? Like it feels early days. It's not common knowledge, and a lot of people are probably loving it and running with it, but it hasn't quite ticked over in a lot of people's minds that this is where it's going, and we need to be part of it.
Yeah. Going back to the flight simulator analogy, in the early days of flight simulators, the scenery was really blocky and the trees didn't look
Mm.
photorealistic and the cities were not properly rendered. But, the latest iteration of Microsoft Flight Simulator, it's like that's my city. I can fly over my house. And it is, you can set as many guardrails or non-guardrails as you wish to simulate flying. And they just have gotten so much better. And synthetic data for marketing purposes is going to do the same. It's just going to get so much better over the next 5 years. And that photorealism, we'll call it, will just improve vastly.
My brother, he had the flight simulator on the Commodore 64, and he would literally spend, because I think it was almost real time. It'd be like, oh, if you want to fly over to Europe, it's going to take 7 hours. So he would start it, and it would like literally take that long. And he would just be staring at these two colors with a line in the middle. I was like, how are you doing this? This is crazy.
Yeah, exactly. But now you can look at the constellations, all kinds
Yeah.
of stuff.
And all the dashboard and everything. You probably dial in
Yeah.
whatever model plane you want and all that stuff. Yeah, you can probably nerd out heavily on this, but it goes to show just how that stuff changes and grows. And I can just imagine where you're at in the next little while, but it's fascinating. It's like, honestly, I'm still wrapping my head around it, but I just feel like it's uncovering a secret treasure trove that everyone needs to know about. So this has been fascinating.
It's exciting. It's an exciting space to be in.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Ray, for spending some of your time. I know you're busy today, but I appreciate the chat. And yeah, hopefully we can connect soon.
It's a pleasure, Pete. I'm glad you reached out, and I really enjoyed our chat. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss another episode. Want to stay up to date on AI on a weekly basis? Get in on our newsletter at artificialbreakdown.com. Stay charged out there.